Hello, I'm Professor Richard Reddy from Montana State University. Today I'm going to talk about ecosystem services, what they are, how we benefit from them, and how we measure the value of those services to us. But before I talk about ecosystem services, I want to talk a bit about the goods and services that a market economy provides. We have a measure of all the goods and services that an economy provides. It's called gross domestic product. Gross domestic product is defined as the market value of all goods and services produced in a country in a year. If GDP is going up, then the economy is growing, and generally that's seen as a good thing. But why is it a good thing? The measured GDP goes up for three reasons. First, prices go up due to inflation. That makes the market value of the things made by an economy increase. That's not really making us better off, so we want to adjust the numbers to take out the effects of inflation. Second, population grows, so we have more people available to make things. But that also means we have to split up our output among more people, so we want to calculate GDP per person. Third, productivity increases over time, which means that the amount of stuff that a single person can produce goes up. This happens because we get better at making things. We have better technology, we have learned how to use that technology better, and we've invested in things like factories and roads and ports that make it possible to make more stuff per person. This is the source of growth that we care most about. So the best way to measure GDP growth in an economy is to look at the GDP per person adjusted for inflation. We call that measure real GDP per capita. In the United States, real GDP per capita has grown dramatically over the last 75 years. This is because we are much more productive than we used to be. We have computers and cell phones and hydraulic fracking and all of the technological advances that allow us to make more stuff. We have interstate highways and jet airplanes that allow us to move that stuff quickly and cheaply. And we have the internet that allows businesses to find workers, find customers, and find other businesses more efficiently. Now, increases in real GDP per capita are generally seen as a good thing, all else equal. Why? First, as real GDP per capita grows, we tend to see more job creation. Second, as real GDP per capita grows, we tend to see higher profits for businesses. But perhaps the most important reason we worry about GDP per capita is that it is the foundation for household income. Our economy is circular, so that roughly speaking, the total value of our GDP is equal to the total income to all of our households. And that total income to all of our households is about equal to the total value of everything that households buy and consume. So if real GDP per capita goes up, that means that households can afford to buy more goods and services, which means that households have a higher standard of living. Now, we do have to worry about whether the wealth that is being created in our economy is being shared by everyone. Since around 1970, the share of GDP wealth that goes to employees has been declining, while the share that goes to business owners and investors has been increasing. But an increase in GDP per capita gives us the potential to make all households better off, and it is certainly better than living in a country where GDP is declining. Now, GDP is measured using market prices to value goods and services. Are we sure that the price of a market good is a good measure of its value? Take apples, a typical market good. Most households buy apples. The average household buys around 40 pounds of apples per year at a price of around $1.50 per pound. Does a household that buys 40 pounds of apples get $60 worth of value out of them? Economists define the value of something to a household as being equal to the largest amount of money that the household would be willing to pay to get the good. In our example, a household that buys 40 pounds of apples at $1.50 per pound must be valuing those apples at least $60. If the perceived value to the household was less than $60, they wouldn't buy the apples. But the value could be much higher than $60. So in this case, the value of the apples to the household is at least as large as the price of the apples, but it could be larger. But we can say more about the marginal value of a pound of apples. Households don't decide whether to buy 40 pounds of apples or 0 pounds of apples. Their decision is much more continuous. How much apples should I buy in a year? 39 pounds, 40 pounds, 41 pounds? Why did this household buy 40 pounds and not 41? As a household buys more and more apples, the value it places on additional apples goes down. We call that the marginal value of the apples. A household that buys 40 pounds of apples perceives the value of the 40th pound of apples to be greater than $1.50. That's why they bought the 40th pound. But it perceives the value of the 41st pound to be less than $1.50. That's why it didn't buy the 41st pound. Because households make decisions like this, we know that the marginal value of an additional pound of apples will always be very close to the price of apples. This means that price can serve as a good signal to us of marginal value. If a grower can grow some more apples and bring them to the market, then the value to households of those additional apples is correctly measured by the market value of the apples. And the increase in GDP that comes from the increased apple production is a good measure of the value households place on the new apples. But people care about things other than the goods and services they purchase. People care about environmental quality, they care about outdoor recreation, they care about wildlife. These are things that are not sold in markets. How do we account for these so-called non-market goods, goods that people care about that they don't buy in markets? Take, for example, a day spent hiking on a local trail. You don't buy the experience in a store. It's almost free. You only have to pay for the gas you use to drive to the trailhead. How do we value that experience if it doesn't have a price? We use the same definition that we used for market goods. The value of a non-market good, such as a day spent hiking, is the amount of money you would be willing to pay to get the non-market good if you had to pay for it. Imagine that every hiking trailhead had an entry fee. You can't go hiking unless you pay money. Would you pay $2 to go hiking for the day if you had to? Would you pay $5? Would you pay $50? The value to you of a day spent hiking is the largest amount you'd be willing to pay to be able to go hiking. Now, fortunately, you don't have to pay an entry fee, but that raises a problem. If there's not a price charged, how do we know the value to you? We want to know that value so that we can make good decisions about whether to build new trails, for example. Now, often, an even more interesting question is, how will the value of a non-market good change if its quality changes? We define the value of a change in the quality of a non-market good as the change in the amount you would be willing to pay to get the good. If you would be willing to pay $20 to hike in a nice forest, but only $5 to hike in a degraded forest, then the value to you of the change in quality is $15. This is the conceptual framework for how we will value all sorts of non-market goods: outdoor recreation opportunities, air and water quality, endangered species preservation, aesthetics, and so on. Up until now, I've been talking about non-market goods, which are things people care about that are not bought and sold in markets. A lot of focus on valuing non-market goods is centered on environmental goods. More recently, the terminology has shifted a bit. Ecologists started to realize that a good way to argue for environmental protection is to highlight the services that ecosystems provide to humans. We define 4 categories of ecosystem services. The first is provisioning services. This includes timber cut from forests, food harvested from the land, fish harvests, drinking and irrigation water. These are things that ecosystems provide to us that we consume. The second category is regulating services. Healthy ecosystems provide flood control and disease and pest control, insects to pollinate our crops, trees that store carbon and maintain a stable climate, etc. The third category is cultural services. This includes outdoor recreation, aesthetics, spiritual benefits, and cultural benefits. Notice that very often things we do to increase some ecosystem services come at the expense of other ecosystem services. For example, If we want to grow more food, we often have to give up wildlife habitat. If we want to cut more timber, we give up some carbon sequestration. It'd be helpful to know the value of these different services so that we can make good choices when making these trade-offs. Finally, the fourth category is supporting services. These are services that support the other three categories. For example, nutrient cycling helps improve water quality, which improves recreational opportunities, a cultural service. Primary production supports food webs, which allows wildlife to grow that can be harvested, a provisioning service. We want to recognize these supporting services, but we don't want to value them independently. If we value primary production and also value wildlife harvest, we'll be counting the same value twice. One important thing to note is that our definition of ecosystem services is very human-centered. These services have value because they provide benefits to humans. If no one benefits, then there is no service. That doesn't mean you have to be in direct contact with an ecosystem to get services from it, but it does mean that the ecosystem service doesn't have an intrinsic value. Ecosystems have value because people value ecosystems. The value does not exist independent of humans. Now, I should point out that I'm describing a framework for value that is used by economists. There are other frameworks of value. An ethicist might view things differently, but I'm an economist, and I'm explaining how economists view the value of an ecosystem. It's tempting, but not very useful in my opinion, to try to measure the total value of all ecosystem services provided worldwide. You may have heard about a study by Robert Costanza and others who estimated that the world ecosystems generate services worth $33 trillion annually in 1995 dollars. That's about twice as large as world GDP. I don't find this a useful number because we can't use it to help guide decisions. We are not considering whether or not to eliminate all ecosystems in the world. That's the only decision that this number could help inform. Instead, we are constantly faced with decisions that will change ecosystems and change the services provided by ecosystems. So we need to know the value of changes in ecosystem services, not the total value of those services. Before we get to methods for the measurement of values of ecosystem services, I want to give you a taxonomy of those values that economists have been using for a while. First, we want to discuss what we call use values. Use values are values that require the person who benefits from the service to have some direct interaction with the ecosystem that provides the service. The first category of use values is consumptive use values. These are values that are derived by consuming something provided by the ecosystem. This category defined by economists matches up fairly well with the provisioning services category defined by ecologists. But some use values do not require consumption of something. Most outdoor recreation activities do not result in removal of consumption of anything. If you go hiking or bird watching in a natural area, you are using the natural area but not using it up. If you breathe clean air and don't cough, you are using the good air quality but not using it up. So these are examples of non-consumptive uses. The last category of use values are indirect use values. These are values that you get from the consequences of the ecosystem's processes. You may not care about white park pine seeds themselves, but you may care about grizzly bears and Clark's nutcrackers that eat them. You may not care about how much carbon is stored in a forest floor, but you may care about climate change. There's a relationship between the ecosystem and the thing you value, but an indirect one. Next, we turn to what are called non-use values. These are values that you place on ecosystems that will never affect you. Even if you never travel to the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, you may still care about the caribou herds there. Even if you never travel to the deep ocean, you may still care about plastics affecting fish and invertebrates there. And you may care even if you are absolutely convinced that those ecosystems are so isolated that there is no interlinkages between them and you. We know that people care about these ecosystems. One way we know is that some people are willing to donate money to protect them. Now, why would people value ecosystems that will never affect them personally? Economists have come up with 4 reasons why people value these ecosystems. First, they may not use the resource now, but may want to preserve the option of using it in the future. We call the value of preserving an ecosystem for possible future use option value. Second, a person may not want to use the resource, but may want future generations to be able to use it. We call this motivation bequest value. Third, a person may not want to use the resource, but may get enjoyment from knowing that other people can use the resource. We call this altruistic value. Fourth, a person may feel altruism toward nature itself. That is, the person may get enjoyment from simply knowing that the ecosystem exists in good condition. Note that this is not the same thing as intrinsic value. Intrinsic value means that the ecosystem has value independent of whether people care about it. Non-use value for an ecosystem only exists because some human holds that value. Now, you may have heard the term existence value. That is the value that someone gets from knowing that an ecosystem exists in good condition. Depending on who is using the term, it could include all 4 of these non-use values, or it could include some subset of them. Unfortunately, different people use the term in different ways, but it always refers to non-use value. Now that we know how to define the value of ecosystem services, and we've talked about what kinds of values might be included, we can turn to the question, how do we go about measuring these values? There are 3 main ways we measure ecosystem service values. I'll discuss each, and then talk a little bit about how we value human health as a special case, since human health is such an important way in which ecosystem health affects us. In some cases, we can use market prices to value ecosystem services. This is most clear when we are valuing provisioning services. For the reasons I stated at the beginning of the talk, when market products such as timber and beef are produced from ecosystems, the value of that production is measured well by the price of the products. We do have to be careful that the prices we observe are true market prices and are not being pushed up or down by contractors who are trying to take advantage of government concessions. But we have a pretty good idea what a board foot of timber is worth and what a pound of beef is worth in wholesale markets, and those prices do a good job telling us the value of those provisioning services. In some cases, we have to be careful. Take the example of subsistence harvest by Native American tribes. What is the value to the tribe of a pound of fish caught and consumed by the tribe? If that additional pound of protein means that households in the tribe can buy 1 less pound of protein at the store, then the value of that provisioning service is equal to the money that is no longer spent at the store. However, if the additional pound of protein from the harvest results in an increase in total protein consumption, then the value of the harvest is greater than the amount of money saved at the store. Now, either way, this approach only values the harvest as meat. It does not include any cultural or spiritual values associated with the harvest. Market prices tell us part of the story, but not the complete story. Market prices can also be used to value some regulating services. If a wetland buffers rainfall and reduces the likelihood of a flood, we can use market prices to value that service. We would calculate the probability of a flood with the wetland and without the wetland, and then multiply the change in probability by the market value of the damage that a flood would cause, including damage to property and to farmland. Those damages would be measured using market prices of the homes and the crops. Now, this approach only captures the physical damage. It does not include the health impacts, including the mental health impacts, or the disruption that a flood can cause to families. Again, market prices tell us an incomplete story. Another example of a regulating service that can be valued using market prices is nutrient removal. If an ecosystem removes nutrients from a river, then a municipality located downstream will be able to avoid some treatment costs when it takes the water for municipal use. The cost savings due to the improved water quality is a value from the ecosystem service of nutrient removal. Again, this approach does not include other values, such as in-stream recreational values associated with the improved water quality. Sometimes there's not a market price that tells us what an ecosystem service is worth, but we can still sometimes observe people making decisions that involve a trade-off between money and ecosystem services, allowing us to value those services. In these cases, we use what are called revealed preference valuation approaches. Because the behavior we observe reveals to us the value that people place on the ecosystem service. One example is outdoor recreation, such as fishing. Here we use an approach called the travel cost model. There's no market price for most fishing trips, but it does cost money to go fishing. You have to buy gas for your vehicle and supplies for the day. If the value to you of going fishing is greater than the cost of going fishing, then you get some net value out of going fishing. This net value is called consumer surplus. It is the difference between how much you value the trip and how much the trip costs you. Anglers have a lot of decisions that they have to make when going fishing. Should I go? Where should I go? What type of fishing should I do? Anglers choose the type and location of fishing that gives them the highest consumer surplus from the trip. By looking at the choices anglers make, we can infer something about the value they place on different aspects of the trip. For example, if an angler drives past one river to get to a different river that has higher quality, we can infer that the angler values the second river higher, and the difference in value between the two rivers is at least as large as the additional cost incurred to get to the second river. Using this approach, we can value a day spent fishing and estimate how that value changes as the quality of the trip changes. Typical values from studies that have done this for a day spent fishing range from $20 to $80 per day. Those would be for normal fishing trips. A unique, high-valued experience, such as a float trip down the Smith River, could be worth thousands of dollars. We turn now to another decision that involves a trade-off between money spent and ecosystem services received. When you buy a house, you not only get the house, you also get a location to live in. That location has certain environmental characteristics. Houses located in places with better ecosystem services sell for more than similar houses located in places with poorer ecosystem services. When choosing a house to buy, you have to make a trade-off between spending money and getting better ecosystem services. As an example of this approach, a study looked at the value that people who live in lakefront homes place on good water quality. The approach is as follows. First, you collect data on lots of different houses that have recently sold. You want information on the physical characteristics of the house, information on water quality near the house, and the price that the house sold for. You then use statistical regression techniques to find out by how much a house's price would increase if the water quality near the house improved, holding all other characteristics of the house constant. In this study, they found that a 1 meter improvement in water clarity, measured using a device called a Secchi disc, results in almost a 2% increase in the value of the home. Even though there's no price for water quality, the market is telling us that that is the value that people place on improved water quality. Revealed preference approaches are great, but they only work in a limited number of cases where we can observe people making choices that involve a trade-off between money and ecosystem services. Sometimes people enjoy values from ecosystem services without ever doing something we can observe. This is particularly true for non-use values. In these cases, the only approach we can use is to ask people questions. In a survey, we ask hypothetical questions where a person imagines they are in a situation where they have to make a trade-off between money and an ecosystem service. The responses to these hypothetical questions tell us the value that people place on the ecosystem service. This approach is called a stated preference approach. For example, a recent study wanted to know the value that Minnesota residents would enjoy if wolves were reestablished in northern Minnesota. Now, most people will never see a wolf in their lifetime, so the values we're measuring here for the most people are predominantly non-use values. The survey used a type of question called a contingent valuation question. In this case, people were asked whether they would support or oppose a plan that would reestablish wolves, but that would cost their household more in higher taxes. The dollar amount of higher taxes varied across survey respondents, so that the researchers could trace out how many people were willing to pay different amounts for this service. They found that the median willingness to pay for wolf reestablishment was between $5 and $20. When you multiply that by the population of Minnesota, you get a fairly large value for this ecosystem service. They also found that willingness to pay tended to be higher in parts of the state that would not have wolves. This suggests that use values for wolves can be negative for some people who are located in areas where the wolves would be. Stated preference approaches like this can be used to value a wide range of ecosystem services. I myself have used these approaches to value farmland preservation, changes to landscapes, wetland preservation, air and water quality improvements, food safety, and renewable energy. I want to finish up by talking about a special situation. One of the primary drivers of environmental regulation is the protection of human health. Here, market prices can provide some useful information, but don't provide the whole picture. A standard approach to valuing changes in human health associated with exposure to pollutants is to calculate the market value of the medical resources used to treat the ill health. If you want to value the improvements to human health from a regulation that would decrease air pollution, you first need to establish a relationship between exposure to air pollution and cases of ill health. So, for example, you would need a dose-response relationship that would tell you how many fewer doctor's office visits, ER visits, and hospitalizations you will get if air quality is improved. You then calculate the market value of the doctor's time, the nurse's time, the medications, the lab tests, etc. This approach is called the cost of illness approach, and it tells you how much of the economy's resources are being used up by ill health associated with air pollution. You can also include the value of the lost work time due to illness. What this approach does not include is the value of the pain and suffering experienced, or the value of lost school time for children, because those are things that do not have prices associated with them. More recently, the cost of illness approach has been replaced, or at least accompanied, by an approach that relies on the same framework we previously established for defining value. It asks, what would people be willing to pay to avoid ill health? That is the value of an improvement in health from a change in environmental quality. Sometimes we can use revealed preference approaches to infer willingness to pay for better health, but often we rely on stated preference approaches. You do have to be careful about how to combine the willingness to pay approach and the cost of illness approach to make sure that you don't count the same cost twice. Now, to sum up, let me wax a little bit philosophical about valuing ecosystem services. First, there is a reason why we regulate pollution, protect endangered species, and keep public lands in public hands. The ecosystem services we've discussed here provide values that are not captured in markets. So businesses can't make profit by providing those services. That's why the government does it. But we need to know what those services are worth so we can make smart trade-offs between services and costs and trade-offs among different services. Some ecosystem services, for example, some provisioning services, are fairly easy to measure. Others are much harder. Some, like spiritual services, may not be measurable in dollar terms at all. There's always a tendency to focus on the things we can measure. We have to be careful to remember the things we aren't measuring. Sometimes we'll find that the ecosystem services we lose when we develop wild areas are not large enough to justify preservation. We need houses, we need roads, we need electric power lines. Building those things will result in diminished ecosystem services. We need to know how much the services that are lost are worth so that we can make smart choices, and so that we can do these things that we need to do in a way that minimizes the losses. Next, comparing the economic value of market goods and ecosystem services provides us useful information that should lead to better decisions, but it is not the only information we should use when making decisions. For example, we care about issues like environmental justice. We may decide that a development that provides huge market value with small loss in ecosystem services is still a bad idea because those losses in ecosystem services are concentrated in a population that has already suffered greatly from past environmental decisions. Economic values are only one piece of information that should affect decisions. Finally, ecosystem service valuations are not carved in stone and handed down from on high. Neither are market prices. They are both human constructs that can change over time as our knowledge changes and as our society changes. But when making decisions that affect ecosystems, it's better to have information about the value of the services affected than to make those decisions blindly. If we don't recognize the value of ecosystem services and try to estimate their value, we run the risk of focusing only on GDP, which doesn't measure everything we value. Well, I want to thank you for watching. I hope you found this talk useful. And if you have any questions or feedback, please don't hesitate to contact me.